They sat her with the servants, and they made sure she understood why. Clara Whitmore had been at Heronwood Hall for 2 years, teaching the 3 Lockwood daughters their scales and their fingering, and she had known the moment the dinner was announced that there would be a reckoning of where, exactly, a music mistress belonged on a night the family meant to shine. The Lockwoods had a duke coming. Mr. Lockwood had made his fortune in shipping, which the world counted as new money, and new money in Hertfordshire spent itself on exactly this: a grand table, a famous guest, a chance to be seen dining with a man whose grandfather's grandfather had been a duke. She had hoped, foolishly, that she might simply not be invited. To be left out would have been a mercy. Instead, Mrs. Lockwood had invited her, because the entertainment of the evening was to be music, and Clara was to provide it, and had seated her at the long side table near the door, with the housekeeper and the steward, and the elderly companion of Mrs. Lockwood's aunt. The servants' table, below the salt, below everything, in full view of the 30 guests at the great table where the candlelight was warmest. Mrs. Lockwood saw her settled there herself, sweeping down in plum silk to make certain Clara understood the arrangement was no accident. "You'll be quite comfortable here, Miss Whitmore." Her voice was pitched to Carrie. "Near the instrument, you see, so practical. We wouldn't dream of taking you from your proper sphere. One must know where one belongs, mustn't one? It's a kindness, really." A few faces at the great table turned, a few smiles, quickly hidden behind glasses. Clara folded her hands in her lap. "How thoughtful," she said. "Yes, near the instrument." She did not flush. She had spent 6 years learning that a steady voice was the one thing in the world no one could take from her, and she kept it steady now, and she looked at Mrs. Lockwood with an expression so perfectly composed that the lady found nothing in it to enjoy, and swept away dissatisfied. The old companion beside her, Mrs. Pelham, who had eaten at lower tables her whole life, patted Clara's wrist under the cloth. "Don't mind her, dear. The food's the same down here, and the company's a great deal better." "I'm beginning to suspect you're right," Clara murmured, and Mrs. Pelham's papery face creased into a smile. At the head of the great table, the Duke of Renford watched the whole thing. New to moonlight at Mayfair? Stay for this one. A music mistress seated with the servants to shame her, a duke at the head of the table, and a single chair that's about to be carried the length of a room. Subscribe before we go on, and if you've been here before, you already know. They thought they were putting her in her place. Watch what happens when the most important man in the room decides her place is the only one worth sitting in. She had not always taught other people's daughters. Clara's father had been a gentleman with a small estate and a large heart and no head whatsoever for money, and when he died, when she was 18, he had left her his library, his old spaniel, and debts that swallowed everything else. The estate went. The spaniel died of age within the year. The library she sold, volume by volume, to pay the rent on smaller and smaller rooms, until the only thing left of her old life was the one thing no creditor could carry off, which was what was in her hands and her head. Her mother had given her music before she died. Not lessons, those Clara had had from masters while the money lasted, but the love of it, the way some people are given a faith. Clara could sit at any instrument and find her way into it. She could hear a thing once and play it back. And she could do the rarer thing, the thing she told no one because telling invited questions a poor woman couldn't afford. She could compose. In the evenings, in whatever cold room she'd come to, she wrote music, airs, and variations, and once a whole set of pieces she'd never played for a living soul, because they were hers, and a woman who has lost everything else holds tightly to the one thing that is hers. She taught to eat. The Lockwood girls were not unkind, only ordinary, and she'd made decent musicians of 2 of the 3, which was 2 more than most masters would have managed. The work was honest, and the pay was thin, and the position was exactly what Mrs. Lockwood had reminded the room it was, below the salt, near the instrument, in her proper sphere. She had made her peace with it. Mostly. What she had not made her peace with, what no amount of steadiness in the voice could quite reach, was how much she still loved the thing they used to shame her. They sat her by the instrument, to remind her she was hired help. And the instrument sat there all evening, glossy in the candlelight, and every fibre of her wanted to cross to it and play, not for them, but for herself, the way she did in the cold rooms at night. She would get her chance soon enough. The entertainment came after dinner. She would play what Mrs. Lockwood expected, something pretty and undemanding, suitable for hired help, and she would go back to her room, and the evening would be survived. That was the plan, until the Duke of Renford stood up. He stood up between the fish and the meat, which was not a thing dukes did, and the great table noticed at once. Mrs. Lockwood half rose, all anxious solicitude. "Your Grace, is something wanting? The footman will—" "Nothing's wanting," he said. "I find I've been seated at the wrong table, that's all." A confused silence. He was at the head, at the place of highest honor, beside the hostess herself. There was no higher table. There was nowhere a duke could be more correctly placed. And then the Duke of Renford picked up his chair, lifted it cleanly, by the back, the way a man lifts a chair he means to move, and carried it the length of the room, past the staring faces, and the lowered glasses, and the candlelight, down to the long side table by the door, and set it down in the gap beside Clara Whitmore. "This seat's free, I think," he said. "May I?" Clara looked up at him. She had a number of feelings at once, and not all of them were gratitude. The man was a duke. He could carry his chair anywhere he liked, and the world would call it charming. She could not. She had to live in this house. Whatever he was about to make of this evening, she was the one who would still be here in the morning, teaching scales to the daughters of a woman he had just humiliated in front of 30 people. "You may sit where you please, Your Grace," she said. "You're a duke. It's rather the entire point of being one." A laugh escaped him. Quick, surprised, genuine. He sat. "That's not a yes," he observed. "It's not a no. I'll take it." He settled himself, entirely at ease, as though dukes dined at servants' tables every evening of the week. Down the room Mrs. Lockwood had gone the color of her plum silk, and was conferring frantically with the butler about whether the great table could be relaid, whether a place could be made. How on earth one unshamed a woman one had spent the whole evening shaming. "She's going to try to move you up to the great table now," the Duke said, following Clara's glance. "Within 5 minutes, you watch. And whose fault will that be?" "Mine entirely." He didn't look remotely sorry. "But you'll refuse it, won't you? You'll stay down here." She raised an eyebrow. "Will I? You strike me as a woman who'd rather keep the seat she chose than be promoted to the one she was denied." He reached for the bread. "Also, the company really is better down here. The lady on your left has been making faces at the hostess for an hour, and I'd like very much to be introduced." Mrs. Pelham leaned forward, delighted. "Mrs. Pelham, Your Grace, and I have not been making faces. I've been appreciating the silk from a critical distance." "Mrs. Pelham, you are the most honest person in this room, and I intend to sit beside you for the rest of the evening." And, exactly as he'd predicted, almost to the minute, the butler arrived at Clara's elbow, sweating gently, to murmur that Mrs. Lockwood would be honored, delighted, if Miss Whitmore would consent to join the family at the great table, where a place had been made. Clara looked at the great table. 30 faces, arranged into welcome now, the same faces that had hidden their smiles an hour ago. "Please thank Mrs. Lockwood," she said, "but I'm quite comfortable here, near the instrument. It's so practical." She heard the Duke of Renford choke on his wine. "You did that on purpose," she said to him, low, while the table around them returned to its business. "I carried a chair across a room. You're the one who just handed the woman her own words back across a butler. That was art. I merely moved furniture." "You moved furniture in front of 30 people who will talk of nothing else for a month, and you'll be in London by Thursday, and I'll be here teaching her daughters and listening to her find ways to make me sorry for it." Clara kept her voice even, but there was an edge under it she let him hear, because it was true, and he ought to know it. "It's a fine thing, Your Grace, to be gallant when you can ride away from the consequences. The bill for tonight comes to me, not you." She watched him take it. She'd expected him to be wounded, or to retreat into charm, the way handsome men did when a woman declined to be charmed. He did neither. He set down his glass and looked at her properly, and the lightness went out of his face, and what replaced it was something steadier. "You're right," he said. "That was thoughtless of me, and I'm sorry for it. I didn't think past the gesture." He turned the glass slowly by its stem. "But I'll tell you why I did it, and then you can decide whether it was worth the bill. I have sat at the head of 1,000 tables exactly like this one. I have watched 1,000 hostesses arrange 1,000 people by rank, and put the ones with no power where everyone could see they had none, and smile while they did it. And I have sat there, at the top, and said nothing, because saying something was inconvenient, and the cruelty was never quite large enough to be worth the trouble." He looked down the room at Mrs. Lockwood. "And tonight, I watched a woman I have never met be told, in front of 30 people, to know her place. And I watched her answer with more grace than anyone at the great table has shown in their lives. And I found I could not sit at the top of the room for one more minute and call myself a decent man." Back to Clara. "So, I picked up my chair. Not to rescue you. You didn't need rescuing. You were managing beautifully. I moved because I was sick to death of being a man who stays seated. There's a difference. I rather think you of all people understand it." Clara was quiet. She had been ready for a great many things: gallantry, condescension, the performance of a man enjoying his own generosity. She had not been ready for honesty, and it disarmed her the way nothing else could have. "That," she said slowly, "is a better reason than I expected." "I'm full of better reasons. People are always surprised." The lightness came back, but gentler now. "Now, they're about to bring the dishes you and I will both pretend to eat, and after that, you're meant to play for these people, and I want to ask you something before you do." "Ask." "Play something you love, not something Mrs. Lockwood would choose, something that's actually yours." He leaned in, and his voice dropped, and there was no performance in it at all. "I came to this dreadful dinner for exactly one reason. I was told the Lockwoods' music mistress was worth the journey. I've sat at the head of that table all night, wondering which of the simpering girls was the one, and then their mother sat the only real person in the room down here by the door, and I understood. It's you. So play me something true, Miss Whitmore. I'll know if you don't." She played something true. She hadn't meant to. The plan had been the pretty, undemanding thing, the safe thing, the hired help thing. But she sat down at the instrument with the whole room watching, and the Duke of Renford's words still in her ears. "Something that's actually yours." And her hands betrayed her, and what came out was hers. It was a piece she'd written in a cold room 2 winters ago, and never played for anyone. It began quiet, almost shy, a single line feeling its way forward in the dark. And then it found its feet, and it grew, and it became the thing she'd made it to be, which was the sound of a person who has lost everything, discovering that the one thing left is enough. There was grief in it, but the grief was not the point. The grief was only the floor the rest of it stood on. What stood on the floor was joy, stubborn, hard-won, unkillable joy. The joy of hands that can still make something out of nothing, of a heart that the world has done its worst to, and could not empty. The room went utterly silent, even Mrs. Lockwood. When the last note let go, and the silence rushed back in, Clara sat with her hands still on the keys, suddenly aware of what she'd done, played her own soul for a room that had seated her with the servants. Then the Duke of Renford spoke, into the hush, from the side table by the door. "Who wrote that?" She turned on the bench. "Your Grace? I know a great deal of music, Miss Whitmore. I play, badly, and I listen, well, and I have spent a fortune collecting it, and I have never heard that piece in my life." He had stood, without his chair this time, and he was looking at her the way she'd never been looked at in 2 years at Heronwood, which means one of 2 things. Either it has never been published, or the person who wrote it is sitting at that instrument, and I think I know which. The room looked at Clara. 30 faces, and the candlelight, and nowhere to hide. She could have denied it. A poor woman learns to make herself small, and small was safer. But she had just played the piece, and the piece was the truest thing about her, and she found she could not stand in the wreckage of her own honesty and lie. "I wrote it," she said, "2 winters ago. I've never played it for anyone." The Duke of Renford crossed the room again, and this time no one breathed a word about it, and stopped at the instrument and looked down at her. "Then this is the most important dinner I have attended in 10 years, he said, "and every person in this room is too foolish to know it. You have a gift I would cross England to hear, and they sat you by the door. Play it again. I want to hear it knowing it's yours." So she played it again, and the second time, she played it for him. He stayed 3 days at Heronwood, which scandalized everyone and surprised no one, and he spent most of the 3 days finding reasons to be wherever the music mistress was. This was harder than it sounds, because Clara had work to do, and no intention of neglecting it for a duke. He learned to find her in the schoolroom in the mornings, where the Lockwood girls were now the most attentive pupils in Hertfordshire, since their lessons had become the place a duke might wander through. He learned to find her at the instrument in the late afternoon, when the house was quiet, and he took to sitting at the far end of the room with a book he never read, just to listen. "You're meant to be entertaining your hosts," she told him on the second afternoon, not stopping playing. "I'm meant to be doing a great many things. I find I don't want to do any of them." He came down the room and stood by the instrument. "Teach me that passage, the one in the left hand that you do, and I can't." "You said you play badly." "I play very badly. It's one of my few genuine humilities. Teach me anyway." So she taught him, and he was as bad as advertised, and she laughed at him, really laughed. The first time in 2 years she'd laughed in that house, when his left hand tangled itself into nonsense for the 4th time. "You're enjoying this," he accused. "I'm enjoying it enormously. A duke who can't play a simple passage. It's the best thing that's happened to me all year. I'll have you know, I've been told I'm very accomplished." "You've been told a great many things, Your Grace, by people who wanted something from you." She put her hands over his on the keys, to show him the shape of it, and neither of them moved for a moment longer than the lesson required. "I don't want anything from you, so I'll tell you the truth. You play like a man giving orders to a piano. Music isn't an order, it's a conversation. You have to listen to it, not command it." He was very still, her hands over his. "That's the second time you've described the difference between commanding and listening," he said quietly. "I'm beginning to think you mean it about more than the piano." "I mean it about everything." She didn't take her hands away. "Try the passage again. Listen this time." He tried it again. He listened. It was still bad, but it was bad in a humbler way, and she nodded, and something passed between them over the keys that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with it. "There," she said. "You see, you can be taught." "I'm discovering I'd like to be," at length. He turned his hands under hers, so they were palm to palm, and looked at her. "By you." For a very long time. She should have drawn back. A music mistress and a duke. It was the oldest, most foolish story in the world, the kind that ended with the mistress dismissed, and the duke married off to someone suitable. She didn't draw back. "That's a dangerous thing to say to the help, Your Grace." "Gabriel," he said, "if we're going to do this properly, and I very much intend that we should, you're going to have to stop your gracing me. My name is Gabriel. It's still dangerous. Everything worth anything is dangerous. You taught me that this afternoon, with your hands on mine, telling me I'd been giving orders to the world my whole life, and calling it living." His thumb moved against hers. "I've been the most important man in every room I've entered since I was 22, Clara, and I have never once, in all of it, met a person who looked at me and saw a man instead of a duke, until a woman they'd seated by the door told me I played the piano like a tyrant." He smiled, and it reached all the way to his eyes. "I'm not letting that walk back to its cold room and disappear. I'd sooner carry every chair in England." Mrs. Lockwood, of course, tried to dismiss her. She tried it on the morning of the fourth day, when the Duke's intentions had become impossible to misread, and the scandal of them had become more than her social ambitions could bear. She summoned Clara to the morning room and informed her, with cold sweetness, that her services as music mistress would no longer be required, that her conduct had been forward and unbecoming, and that she might collect her wages and be gone by noon. Clara had expected it. She'd told Gabriel it would come, and he'd told her to let it, and she'd decided he was right, because there was nothing left to stay for, and a great deal waiting if she went. "Of course, Mrs. Lockwood," she said. "I'll be gone by noon. I'm glad you understand my place." "Yes, you've been very clear about my place since the night of the dinner." Clara picked up her wages from the table. "I do understand it now, better than you do, I think." And she inclined her head, the same composed, perfectly courteous inclination she'd given the woman across the servants' table, and walked out. She did not walk out alone. The Duke of Renford was waiting in the hall with his carriage already brought round, and he handed her into it in front of the whole staring household, and as it pulled down the drive, he took her hand and held it. "Where to?" he asked. "You tell me. You're the one with the carriage." "London, I thought. I keep a house there with a music room I've never used, because I've never had anyone worth playing for in it." He raised her hand to his lips. "It has a very good instrument and a very bad pianist, who needs lessons rather urgently, and I thought perhaps the finest composer in England might consent to take him in hand. The finest composer in England is unemployed as of this morning. How fortunate. I have a position to offer her." He looked at her, and the teasing softened into the thing underneath it. "Marry me, Clara, not as a music mistress, not as anyone's hired help ever again, as the woman who taught me the difference between commanding the world and listening to it, which is the most important thing anyone has taught me in my life, and I'd like the rest of it to keep being taught." She looked out at the Hertfordshire road unspooling behind them, away from the cold rooms and the lower tables and the woman who'd told her to know her place. Then she looked back at him. "You'll never learn that passage in the left hand," she warned. "Not if I teach you for 50 years. "Then teach me for 50 years and let me fail at it." He grinned. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." And she laughed, and he kissed her, and the carriage carried them both away from the house that had seated her with the servants, and toward a music room that had been waiting, empty, for exactly her. They were married before the spring, in a small church with a very fine organ, and she played at her own wedding because she wanted to, and because no one alive could have stopped her. Word of it reached Heronwood, naturally. Word of everything reached Heronwood, and Mrs. Lockwood received the news that the music mistress she had seated below the salt was now the Duchess of Renford, the way one receives a blow one has dealt oneself, which is to say, with a great deal of company, all of it remembering exactly where she'd put the new Duchess on the night of the dinner, and exactly which guest had carried his chair the length of the room to sit beside her. Clara never troubled herself about Mrs. Lockwood again. She had a music room now, and a bad pianist to teach, and a great house in London where the cruelest thing that ever happened at her table was a wrong note, gently corrected. She composed openly, under her own name, and her work was played in rooms grander than any that had ever seated her by the door, and Gabriel sat in every one of them, in the best seat in the house, listening, which was the one thing he had finally learned to do well. Years later, at a dinner of their own, a young governess was shown in among the guests, nervous, plainly dressed, plainly uncertain whether she belonged. Clara watched the table take her measure and find her wanting, the way tables did. She rose from her place at the head, picked up her chair, and carried it the length of the room to sit beside the girl. "This seat's free, I think," she said. "May I?" And down the table, the Duke of Renford smiled into his wine, and got up, and went to fetch his own chair